Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into a pretty uncomfortable reality about human judgment. We are going to explore the hidden architecture of our minds, specifically those invisible cognitive traps that warp how we view other people, how we dish out blame, and how we justify the world around us. So let's get right into it.
So think about this. Why do good, deeply empathetic people often end up blaming victims for their own suffering? Sounds wild, right? It's a total paradox. We all like to think of ourselves as rational and compassionate. And yet, when we're confronted with someone else's misfortune, whether that's a bad accident, poverty, or even an assault, our brains frequently run this automatic, behind-the-scenes calculation that somehow places the fault squarely on the person who was harmed. To figure out why we do this, we really have to look at the mental shortcuts our brains use every single day.
Let's break this down with a classic stickman traffic jam scenario. Picture it. You're driving, minding your own business, and bam, a stickman in another car aggressively cuts you right off. Your brain instantly goes, wow, what a jerk. They are incredibly selfish. You've just made a dispositional attribution. You blame their personality. But wait, what happens when you cut someone off? Suddenly, the whole narrative shifts. You're not a bad person. You just really need to find a restroom. Or maybe you're rushing to a career-defining meeting. You blame the situation. This glaring double standard, it's the foundation for absolutely everything we are going to unpack today.
Okay, so this brings us to our first big concept, the baseline mechanism driving all of this, known as the fundamental attribution error.
To really understand how that traffic jam logic scales up into massive societal issues, we need to look at this foundational psychological concept. The fundamental attribution error, or FAE, was a term famously coined by psychologist Lee Ross back in 1977, building on some earlier work by Edward Jones and Victor Harris. Basically, it's a cognitive bias where we massively overemphasize personality factors and completely underemphasize environmental or situational factors when we judge others. Why do we do this? Well, honestly, the human mind is bombarded with data all day long, and it loves a good cognitive shortcut. The person standing right in front of you is highly visible, they capture your attention. But the complex situational forces acting on them, those are invisible. So it's just way easier for your brain to categorize complex human actions as simple character flaws rather than doing the hard work of analyzing the hidden context.
Here's a perfect example of this error in everyday action. Imagine you're at the grocery store and you see our little stickman shopper walk right past an elderly person who's clearly struggling to reach a can on the top shelf. The reflexive thought is instant, right? What a selfish personality. But the actual reality, which is totally hidden from your view, is that the shopper suffers from severe back pain. They physically cannot lift heavy objects or reach up. Their failure to help is because of a physical limitation, not some lack of empathy. But because we don't have that crucial piece of hidden data, our brain just jumps straight to a harsh, dispositional judgment.
Now let's turn the dial up. This brings us to the core fallacy of today's explainer, the Just-World Fallacy.
So what happens when our brains apply this glitchy logic to really severe, high-stakes situations? Back in 1977, psychologist Melvin J. Lerner hit the nail on the head. He identified that we all have this deep, almost desperate psychological need for the universe to be an orderly, safe, and fair place. We are incredibly motivated to believe that, people get what they deserve and they deserve exactly what they get. If you are a good person, good things will happen to you. It's a comforting thought. But the really dangerous flip side here is that if something terrible happens to someone, our brain automatically assumes they must have done something to bring it on themselves.
And here is the absolute kicker. This victim blaming isn't usually coming from a place of malice. It's actually a coping mechanism. Social psychologist Kelly Shaver called this defensive attribution, and it is fundamentally driven by pure fear. Because think about it. If we can blame the victim of a tragedy for their outcome, saying, oh, they walked in the wrong neighborhood, or they wore the wrong thing, or they made a terrible financial choice, we are secretly reassuring ourselves. We're telling our own anxious brains, well, I wouldn't make that mistake, therefore I am safe from this random tragedy. It is entirely an illusion of control.
But as you might guess, clinging to that illusion comes with some pretty heavy consequences. Let's look at the real-world danger and the dark side of this kind of blame.
Holding on to that illusion of control comes at an incredibly steep price for society. When we're constantly blaming people's characters instead of their circumstances, we naturally start stereotyping entire groups of people. Worse, it lets us just completely ignore massive systemic inequities, Like, if we just decide poverty is solely caused by the laziness of individuals, guess what? We never actually have to address the structural or environmental factors driving that poverty. It also fuels horrific victim blaming in cases of abuse or random accidents, just so bystanders can preserve their precious sense of a just world. And finally, it perpetually reinforces the self-serving bias.
Let's actually look at how the self-serving bias totally twists reality to protect our egos. It goes exactly like this. When it comes to ourselves, if we succeed, oh, it's because we're brilliant, skilled, and worked hard. But if we fail, total bad luck, or the test was rigged. Now flip that completely when we observe others. If someone else succeeds, we think, they just got lucky or had an unfair advantage. But if they fail? Well, that's because of their poor choices. It's this completely rigged ledger in our heads that constantly strokes our own self-esteem while totally diminishing the realities of the people around us.
Okay, enough doom and gloom. How do we actually fix this? Let's get into the cognitive solution and how to overcome these built-in biases.
If our brains are literally hardwired for these cognitive shortcuts, are we just doomed to be overly judgmental forever? Absolutely not. Enter a really empowering mental model called the local rationality principle. Basically, it states that people generally do reasonable things given their own goals, their knowledge, and what they're focusing on in that specific moment. It forces us to step back and realize that from the inside of someone else's little stickman reality, their actions make total sense to them. So instead of instinctively yelling, "Why is this person being so stupid or selfish?" this principle trains us to ask a better question. What context am I missing that makes this behavior completely rational to them?
A fantastic, practical way to apply this is something called the substitution test, which was outlined by James Reason in 1997. It's super simple. If you're furious at a colleague for making a mistake, run this quick test in your head. If you took a completely different, equally competent, well-meaning person and dropped them into the exact same environment with the exact same wild time crunch and lack of info, would they have made the exact same mistake? If the answer is yes, then you have a situational system problem, not a people problem. It's honestly a real game changer for stopping that fundamental attribution error dead in its tracks.
So how do we make this a daily habit? We've got 4 science-backed steps right here. First up, increase awareness. Honestly, just by watching this explainer, you're already doing it. You now know that FASE exists. Number 2, challenge your assumptions. When you feel that snap judgment creeping in, hit pause. Force yourself to look for a situational explanation. Third, promote cultural sensitivity. Remember that different backgrounds interpret behaviors and constraints totally differently. And finally, encourage perspective taking. Actively practice mentalizing. Put yourself in their shoes to manually override those lazy, ego-driven shortcuts your brain loves to take.
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought today. The very next time you feel that quick flash of frustration, the next time you instantly judge someone, just stop for a second and ask yourself, are you truly blaming the person or are you just ignoring their situation? Overcoming our attributional biases isn't about letting bad behavior off the hook. It's about seeing the world accurately, fairly, and with the kind of empathy our default brains try to deny us. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep questioning how you think.